Catherine Susan Kitty Genovese was born in the Brooklyn borough of New York on July 7, 1935, the eldest of 5 children of Italian-American parents Rachel and Vincent Andronell Genovese. Kitty was raised Catholic, living in a brownstone residence at 29 St. John's Place in Park Slope, a western Brooklyn neighborhood populated mainly by families of Italian and Irish heritage. As a teen, Kitty attended the all-girl Prospect Heights High School. Her classmates recalled Kitty as being playful, with a sunny disposition. In 1954, after her mother witnessed a gruesome murder, Kitty's family moved to New Canaan, Connecticut, while Kitty, who had recently graduated from high school, remained in Brooklyn with her grandparents to prepare for her upcoming marriage. Later that year, the couple wed, but the marriage was annulled near the end of 1954 due to Kitty coming out as a lesbian. After moving into an apartment in Brooklyn, Kitty worked several clerical jobs in the city, which she found boring. By the late 1950s, now an adult, she had accepted a position as a bartender in a local bar. However, in August 1961, she was briefly arrested for bookmaking, as she had been taking bets on horse races from bar patrons. She and a friend were fined $50 each, and as a result of the arrest, she lost her job. Kitty obtained another bartending position at Ev's 11th Hour Bar on Jamaica Avenue and 193rd Street in Hollis, Queens. Because of her deft skills at cocktail mixing and the ease she had with customers, she was soon managing the bar on behalf of its absentee owner. By working double shifts, she was able to purchase a cute red Fiat and save money, which she intended to use to open an Italian restaurant someday. Kitty also shared her Kew Gardens apartment at 82-70 Austin Street with Mary and Zelenko, her lover since 1963. A fiercely independent woman, Kitty found solace in the company of beautiful women. For Kitty, connections with women embodied an empowering intersection of love and authenticity. Kitty met Mary and Zelenko at Swing Rendezvous, an underground lesbian bar in Greenwich Village. Finding a romantic partner in Mary and was Kitty's act of embracing her truest self. Their relationship was built on an unbreakable thread of self-discovery and inspiring defiance. The couple quickly fell in love and decided to move in together in a quaint second-floor flat next to the Long Island Railroad Station in Kew Gardens, a neighborhood in Queens. At approximately 2:30 a.m. on March 13, 1964, Kitty left Ev's 11th Hour Bar full of spirits and eager to get home to her girlfriend, Mary, and after a double shift, and began driving home in her red Fiat. She drove north toward Grand Central Parkway and then turned westward on the highway toward Kews Garden. While waiting for a traffic light to change on Hoover Avenue, she was spotted by Winston Moseley, who was sitting in his parked Chevrolet Corvair. Kitty arrived home around 3:15 a.m. and parked her car in the Kew Gardens Long Island Railroad Station parking lot, about 100 feet from the door to her apartment, in an alleyway at the rear of the building. As she walked toward the building, Winston Moseley, who had followed her home, exited his vehicle, which he had parked at a corner bus stop on Austin Street. Armed with a hunting knife, he approached Kitty.
I got in the car and drove to Queens Boulevard and Yellowstone Avenue, and I started cruising the neighborhood, looking for a woman alone in a car. About 3 o'clock, I did manage to find one on the street. I don't know, say about 10 blocks from her house, and I followed her. She drove to a parking lot and stopped her car. As soon as she stopped hers, I was following her and I stopped mine. While she was getting out of her car, I had already gotten out of mine and I ran into the parking lot before she really got out of the car. She got out of the car and she saw me and she was frightened right away and she started to run. I ran after her and stabbed her twice in the back.
Kitty screamed, "Oh my God, he stabbed me. Help me."
Several neighbors heard her cry, but only a few of them recognized the sound as a cry for help. When Robert Moser, one of the neighbors, shouted at the attacker, "Let that girl alone," Winston Moseley ran away and Kitty slowly made her way toward the rear of the building.
Somebody yelled and I was frightened. So I jumped back into the car, backed the car to the nearest cross street, and backed down this street about half a block. I decided that even though the person had yelled, they weren't going to come down the street to see what happened to her. And I noticed as I was backing the car back that the woman had gotten up and appeared to be going around the corner. So I came back thinking that I would find her. I came back into the parking lot and thought maybe she had gone to the train station. She wasn't in the train station. It was locked. So I said, well, to myself, well, perhaps she is in one of these hallways. I tried the first door in this row of houses, and the door was locked. The second door I tried opened, and there she was laying on the floor. When she saw me, she started screaming again. So I stabbed her a few more times. She seemed to quiet down a little bit, so she wasn't really struggling that hard with me now. So I lifted up her skirt, and I cut off her girdle. I even cut or pulled her panties off, and she had a sanitary pad, and I picked that out and threw it away, and I stabbed her again in the stomach. I cut off her brassiere, and I don't remember whether I cut her blouse or not, and I took one of the false pads that she had in the brassiere, because it had blood on it, and I touched it with my finger, and I didn't want to leave it. I attempted to have sexual intercourse with her, but I was unable to as I was impotent. I did have an orgasm. However, I looked through her pockets, and I took everything she had in her pockets, which were some keys, some makeup, a bottle of pills, and $49 she had in cash.
Out of view of the street, and of those who may have heard or seen any sign of the initial attack, Winston Moseley stabbed Kitty several more times before attempting to rape her, before settling to steal $49 from her and running away again. The attack spanned approximately half an hour, and knife wounds in Kitty's hands suggested that she attempted to defend herself. Her neighbor and close friend, Sophia Farrar, found Kitty shortly after the second attack and held her in her arms, whispering, "Help is on the way," until an ambulance arrived. Records of the earliest calls to police are unclear, but the calls were not given a high priority. The incident occurred for years before New York City implemented the 911 emergency call system. One witness said his father called the police after the first attack and reported that a woman was beat up but got up and was staggering around. A few minutes after the second attack, another witness, Carl Ross, called friends for advice on what to do before calling the police. Kitty was picked up by an ambulance at 4:15 a.m. and died en route to the hospital. She was buried on March 16, 1964, in Lakeview Cemetery in New Canaan, Connecticut, near her parents and other siblings. Mary Enzelenko, Kitty's girlfriend, was questioned by a detective at 7 a.m. on the morning after the murder. She was later interrogated for 6 hours by two homicide detectives whose questioning centered on her relationship with Kitty Genovese. This was also the police's focus when they questioned the couple's neighbors. Initially, Mary Enzelenko was considered to be a suspect. On March 19, 1964, 6 days after the stabbing, Winston Moseley was arrested for suspected robbery in Ozone Park after a television set was discovered in the trunk of his car. The car was searched after a local man, Raoul Cleary, became suspicious when he saw Winston Moseley removing the television from a neighbor's house. Cleary questioned Winston Moseley, who claimed to be a removal worker. However, after consulting another neighbor, Jack Brown, who confirmed that the homeowners were not moving, Cleary called the police. Brown disabled Winston Moseley's car to ensure he could not flee before police arrived. A detective recalled that a white car similar to Moseley's had been reported by some of the witnesses to Kitty Genovese's murder, and he informed detectives Carroll and Sang. During questioning, Moseley admitted to the murders of Kitty Genovese and two other women, Annie Mae Johnson, who had been shot and burned to death in her apartment in South Ozone Park a few weeks earlier, and 15-year-old Barbara Kralik, who had been killed in her parents' Springfield Gardens home the previous July. Winston Moseley was 29 years old at the time he murdered Kitty Genovese. He was from Ozone Park, Queens, and worked at Remington Rand as a tab operator, preparing the punched cards used at that time mainly for data input for digital computers. Winston Moseley was married with 3 children and had no criminal record. While in custody, he confessed to killing Genovese. He detailed the attack, corroborating the physical evidence at the scene. He said that his motive for the attack was simply to kill a woman, saying he preferred to kill women because they were easier and didn't fight back. He stated that he got up that night around 2 o'clock in the morning while his wife was working nights as a registered nurse and drove through Queens to find a victim. He saw Kitty Genovese on her way home and followed her to the parking lot before killing her.
While this was going on, as I mentioned, I thought that I heard somebody opening a door upstairs, and as a matter of fact, I could hear a mumbled voice upstairs, but when I looked up the stairs, I didn't see anybody, and as I thought, nobody actually comes downstairs, so I looked up there one more time before I went out the door, and I still didn't see anybody, and I came out the door, and instead of going back through the parking lot, I walked around the block and came back on the opposite side of the street. The only thing I saw was a milk truck with a deliverman in it, and I walked around to the car and back to the street, parallel to the street that I first followed her on, and I started driving home. As I drove home, I threw out the keys, the bottle of makeup, and the pills that I had thrown out right by the parking lot, and the case that the pills were in I threw out on the street as I was driving along. I go to Hillside Avenue and Van Wyck Expressway and stopped and threw out this rubber false pad from the brassiere that I picked up. From there, I went straight home.
Winston Moseley also confessed to murdering and sexually assaulting 2 other women and to committing between 30 to 40 burglaries. Winston Moseley was charged with the murder of Kitty Genovese, but was not charged with the other 2 murders he had admitted to. For the police, a complicating factor was that another man, Alvin Mitchell, had also confessed to the murder of Barbara Kralik. Winston Moseley's trial began on June 8, 1964, and was presided over by Judge J. Erwin Shapiro. Winston Moseley initially pleaded not guilty, but his attorney later changed his plea to not guilty by reason of insanity. During his testimony, Winston Moseley described the events on the night he murdered Kitty Genovese, along with the 2 other murders to which he had confessed and numerous other burglaries and rapes. The jury deliberated for 7 hours before returning a guilty verdict at around 10:30 in the evening on June 11th. On June 15th, Winston Moseley was sentenced to death for the murder of Catherine Susan Kitty Genovese. When the jury foreman read the sentence, Moseley showed no emotion, while some spectators applauded and cheered. Judge Shapiro added, "I don't believe in capital punishment, but when I see a monster like this, I wouldn't hesitate to pull the switch myself." On June 23rd, Moseley appeared as a defense witness in the trial of Alvin Mitchell for the murder of Barbara Kralik. After being granted immunity from prosecution, he testified that he had killed Kralik. The trial produced a hung jury, but Alvin Mitchell was convicted in a second trial. On June 1st, 1967, the New York Court of Appeals found that Winston Moseley should have been able to argue that he was medically insane at the sentencing hearing when the trial court found that he had been legally sane, and the sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. Initially, Kitty Genovese's murder did not receive much media attention in the New York City metropolitan area. It was New York City Police Commissioner Michael J. Murphy who got the media to pay attention to the senseless murder by initiating the conversation with New York Times Metropolitan editor Abe Rosenthal, who then got the New York Times to conduct an investigative report around the incident. However, the article that followed became controversial in its approach. The article focused more on the apathy of life in big cities and its relation to senseless crimes than the circumstances of Kitty Genovese's murder. The public view of the story crystallized around a quote from the article by an unidentified neighbor who saw part of the attack, but deliberated before finally getting another neighbor to call the police, saying, "I didn't want to get involved." This statement seemed to be the thesis of the article. It painted the picture that Kitty Genovese would have probably lived had the vast witnesses to her murder had just bothered to call the police on her behalf. However, in the modern era, it slowly came to light that the original version of events about the murder of Kitty Genovese that persisted for decades were unfounded. There was no evidence for the presence of nearly 40 witnesses to Kitty Genovese's murder. Most of the witnesses did not observe the actual murder as it occurred in a darkened hallway of a 2-story building across the street of the high-rise apartment building. After Winston Moseley's death in prison as one of the longest-serving inmates, in March 2016, the New York Times called their second story flawed, stating, "While there was no question that the attack occurred and that some neighbors ignored cries for help, the portrayal of 38 witnesses as fully aware and unresponsive was erroneous." The article grossly exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they had perceived. None saw the attack in its entirety. Only a few had glimpsed parts of it or recognized the cries for help. Many thought they had heard lovers or drunks quarreling. There were 2 attacks, not 3, and afterward, 2 people did call the police. A 70-year-old woman ventured out and cradled the dying victim in her arms until they arrived. Ms. Kitty Genovese died on the way to a hospital. Because of the layout of the apartment building and the fact that the attacks took place in different locations, no witness saw the entire sequence of events. Investigation by police and prosecutors showed that approximately a dozen individuals had heard or seen portions of the attack, though none saw or were aware of the entire incident. Only one witness, Joseph Fink, was aware Genovese was stabbed in the first attack, and only Carl Ross was aware of it in the second attack. Many were entirely unaware that an assault or homicide had taken place. Some thought what they saw or heard was a domestic quarrel, a drunken brawl, or a group of friends leaving the bar when Moseley first approached Kitty Genovese. After the initial attack punctured her lungs, leading to her eventual death from asphyxiation, It is unlikely that Miss Kitty Genovese was able to scream at any volume.
Whichever approach is taken regarding the events that occurred during the murder of Kitty Genovese, the story of the witnesses who did nothing is taught in every introduction to psychology textbook in many Western countries and has been made popularly known through various forms of media from television, movies to YouTube videos. Kitty Genovese's legacy and the bystander effect has now become married together. One cannot think of the Kitty Genovese case without immediately associating it with the bystander effect, which is a psychological phenomenon where individuals are less likely to offer help in the presence of others. Witnesses may assume that others will intervene, diffusing individual responsibility to act. However, Kitty Genovese's life should be remembered more than her murder. It's interesting that the story of her murder is used to highlight the ways people ignore each other, and yet her sexuality and lively personality so often go unnoted. Even the very area where her murder occurred is oftentimes not a central aspect of her story. Kew Gardens was not a dangerous place, even in the 1960s. Most of the Mowbray apartment residents were Holocaust survivors, and their only irritant was the noisy Bailey's pub on the corner. The pub was the only source of drama in the area. Drunken fights occasionally broke out, and lovers' quarrels would often get loud. The people living in her Tudor-style building knew Kitty. They saw her come and go from work and invited her and her girlfriend, Mary and Zielonko, over for dinner. Their love for each other was forged by intense intimacy and authenticity. Kitty Genovese was an endearingly irreverent young woman full of zeal whose time on this earth was cut short by a pointless act of violence. Love is the voice under all silences, the hope which has no opposite in fear. The strength so strong mere force is feebleness. The truth more first than sun, more last than star. E. Cummings.